So next up, I wanted to talk about boss battles, and believe it or not, I've been thinking of the question of boss battles and are they still relevant? Are they still important in gaming? Now, it might seem like a very odd question to ask. Boss battles have been one of the staples of our gaming experiences, and I think because of that, it goes overlooked and underanalyzed. But there were two games this past fall that really got me to consider whether boss battles are still relevant in 2016. The first game was Halo 5, and the second was Super Mario Maker. Now, why did these games get me to question whether boss battles are even necessary anymore? Well, Halo 5, if you haven't played it, it is really a terrific game. I'm not a fan of modern games, certainly not a fan of shooters, but there was something about Halo 5 that I really enjoyed. The combat was excellent. It really, the sound design and the level design, it just sort of gave you this really tight, tactile, exciting feel. But beyond that, one of the things I liked about Halo 5 was that it did not have traditional boss battles. Without spoiling the story, if you still want to play it, there's basically one kind of enemy, one sort of, alpha enemy, if you want to call it that, who you fight constantly. And it seems like a boss the first time you fight him, but as you encounter him, or multiple versions of him, as you move throughout the game, it's not so much about knowing what it takes to defeat him. In fact, once you figure out the initial patterns and his initial weaknesses, he's actually quite easy to defeat. But rather than give you a boss that has incredible powers and, innumerable hit points, the boss structure, if you want to even call it that, of Halo 5 is to put this particular character, make you fight him in a number of different environments, so that certain environments accentuate his strengths and weaknesses. He will, at various times, sort of have different enemies that assist him, and as you move through the game, you'll find any number of fights where you're fighting this warden, he's called, and there's all sorts of different enemies that, even if you have a favorable terrain, will compromise your shot lines that you have on this guy, or you'll have multiple versions of him doing different things. And I thought that was a fundamentally interesting approach. I was enjoying the game a lot more, I was enjoying the environments a lot more, and I was enjoying the challenge of not necessarily having to worry about, what's going to crop up next in the progression of bosses, but just simply, how am I going to fight this guy based on the different map features of this level? Now, Mario Maker was kind of the same. While you could have the traditional King Koopa boss at the end and have different styles of him based on the different Mario games, I felt like as you were running through the Mario challenges, as you were just sort of browsing and searching for levels and playing them, it was just a string of Mario games. You didn't have to worry about, what's the Koopa Kid at the end. You were just enjoying the experience of the game without having to have the interruption of a boss battle. And I think intuitively, and it was perhaps something I never communicated even to myself as a kid, that the boss battles were a disruption. Now, of course, they were a very, very important structural element of all classic games, whether we're talking about arcade games where the boss characters were there to, as I actually kind of discussed in the last podcast with my analysis of functional inequality and how that worked in the arcade and home video game scene. They were a way to extend playtime, to force replays, and in the case of the arcade, to enhance coin-in. But I think as time moved on, it was just assumed, okay, you're going to have a boss battle. And it affects the continuity of the game. It affects, I actually think, your enjoyment of the game. And another thing that reminded me of this, strangely enough, was that I finally got my hands on Sonic Colors, which has been recommended to me by a number of people over the years. And in that game, and I haven't beat it, I haven't even really played it for more than a couple of hours, Yet I noticed that in the first couple of areas you have multiple acts, rather than just Act 1, Act 2, maybe an Act 3, and then Dr. Robotnik or Eggman or whatever you call him now. You had a number of really, really good 3D levels. Now, of course, I'm not a big fan of the 3D Sonic, but these are actually pretty good 3D levels for a 3D Sonic game. And I got to thinking, well, wouldn't it have been great on Sonic 2, for example, on the Genesis, instead of only having 2 acts, what if you had 5 or 6 really well-designed acts? So, again, I'm not going to discount, I'm not going to criticize old games for using the boss as a sort of a functional and structural strategy to get you to have the most enjoyment out of the game. The question is, today in 2016, when we're capable of so much more, is it necessary just to have the boss as a progression point? And I think it varies based on genre. I'll give you a couple of genres that I think still benefit from the boss, and one would be, of course, the role-playing game or the SRPG. And here I'm talking about JRPGs, because, in a JRPG, you're not simply having the Halo-style battle where you're on a map and there are a number of enemies and you're taking them out. You're seeing an enemy, you're splashing to a battle screen. Maybe that screen or maybe that battle engine can only have 4 to 6 enemies on it at one given time. So at a certain point, that gets boring. You're going to need a boss character that forces you to change up your strategies, that forces you to manage your inventory in different ways, manage your job skills in different ways, manage your magic and spells and what have you. So I don't think it's going to go away in that context. Similarly, in a strategy RPG, I think you're going to encounter situations where you can have multiple, in that case, multiple enemies on a screen, but how many of the same enemy can you fight? You need that boss character to change it up. So we'll bracket that. Now, in a third-person shooter or beat-em-up game, do you need boss characters here? And that's where I would say probably not. If you look at a game, and let's take The Division, which actually came free with my PC, and I can't say that I particularly like it. I've just kind of been playing through it, a couple missions here and there. I don't necessarily have any plans on continuing with it for any length of time, but in a game like that, or in a game like Destiny, the approach to the boss character seems to be not so much that you don't get a boss character, but that it just takes a lot of shots. There's this bullet sponge effect, really, really prevalent in Destiny, where you're just, in my experience with Destiny, hiding behind cover, shooting and shooting and shooting and trying to eventually knock out this boss character. Again, it's not that authentic. It's actually kind of boring. So there, much like in Halo, much like in the first-person shooters, I think probably you just want to focus on level design. Just create a great level with a number of different enemies with some challenging terrain and allow the player to enjoy it that way. I don't think there needs to be a boss character mechanically or structurally in the level. Now, of course, there's the issue of narrative. Obviously, boss characters have, I would say, a long narrative lineage in gaming, in the sense that, especially in the early Japanese games, there was the sense, and I guess this sort of connects back to anime and things like that, that you need the grand battle, that the grand battle between two powerful characters is something intrinsically exciting to science fiction and fantasy and things like that. So that's a different story, and I think you could still probably express that without the traditional boss. But anyway, we'll put in the bracket of games that don't need it: third-person action games, first-person shooters. You get to fighters, and here, I mean, Street Fighter 4, of course, had Seth, but Seth, if I remember correctly, was just sort of borrowing from the moves from all the different characters and sort of combining them into one. Was that really a necessary character? I think it's a marginal character. I think you can get a boss-like battle. Obviously, the King of Fighters series gave you, of course, you were having teams of three, and then you would come across the one guy or the couple of guys who would just be, one super-powered character, and it would take three of your guys to beat him in most cases. So you could take that approach, but I think that's more of a peripheral issue in fighting games. 2D platformers, because we don't have a lot of 3D platformers. I would say 2D platformers, at this point, as Mario Maker showed us, we don't really need them anymore. I think, again, here, level design and level variety and level challenge should be more important than having a great boss battle. And I feel that that's why I enjoy those games. I enjoy experiencing the levels, the challenge levels. That's not to say that you can't have like a Mega Man style mid-boss in the level. Not too difficult to beat, but not a boss that kind of breaks up the continuity of the level. So I am hoping that this reevaluation of the boss character continues. Now, I realize, and again, people are probably going to come after me and say, well, the boss battle is itself nostalgic. It's part of why we enjoy gaming. And I can see that to a degree. However, I don't know that we can call it nostalgic because there hasn't been a shift away from the boss, really, as far as I can tell. Now, you may have other examples where the boss battle doesn't feature prominently, but I think for the most part it is just a trope, it is just a feature that we've come to uncritically expect from the games that we play. So I don't know that we can be nostalgic about it because it's never really left. I think we should try to create new types of experiences without the traditional boss battle, or kind of reincorporate it or redefine it and see what happens, and then we can determine, okay, should we go back? Is the nostalgia for boss battles strong enough? Arguably, there's a nostalgia for difficult boss battles. They seem to have gotten easier as gaming has evolved. That's, to me, is not a huge problem, but let's see what the alternative is, and then let us decide, okay, is this something that we need to maintain, or can we sort of leave it in the past and move on?